Hello and welcome to Cleveland Classic Cinema. Tonight we're going to dip into the rich heritage of classic television again so I can reintroduce you to one of my favorite shows ever. Car 54, Where Are You? Okay, before I begin, I want to give a big hello and a big thank you to all the guys at the 5th District. You guys need to get paid more for the good work you do, and that goes for all the Cleveland policemen and firemen. God bless you all. At the advent of television, the pickings were pretty slim. That proud tradition continues with this show, by the way, so we're keeping things honest, if nothing else. Hollywood actors would never deign to appear on what was seen as the competition, and stage actors were pretty much the same way. What viewers got in the early days were mostly old vaudeville acts and burlesque comedians who were forced to clean up their acts for broadcast. But into the 50s, the medium became more refined as writers like Patty Chayefsky, Rod Serling, Horton Foote, and Gore Vidal began working in the medium. Early programs like the Kraft Television Playhouse and Playhouse 90 presented now classic dramas such as Requiem for a Heavyweight, The Miracle Worker, In the Presence of Mine Enemies, and Judgment at Nuremberg, with directors like Arthur Penn, John Frankenheimer, George Roy Hill, and Sidney Lumet at the helm. After a while, the technology caught up with the talent and film TV shows such as I Love Lucy, The Twilight Zone, and Alfred Hitchcock Presents, refined the rough edges of live television. As much as a nut I am about movies, I was even more into television as a kid. Having no interest in sports, I didn't have many friends, and the few that did hung out with me because, that did hang out with me did it more out of convenience than anything else. I had one or two good friends, but for the most part, I was pretty much a loner as a kid. I think that may be why I developed such a great imagination. There was no one else to play it with, so I had to entertain myself. Monsters were one outlet. I've talked many times about how I was hooked on Famous Monsters of Filmland, and I just ate that stuff up. I watched Thriller with Boris Karloff, The Twilight Zone, The Outer Limits, although that was a bit cerebral for me at that age. And of course, Ghoulardi, followed by Big Chuck and Houlihan. I had nightmares like crazy. I used to sleep in the top bunk of a bed set, which meant, when I was sleeping, I was pretty much at eye level with all the monsters that came out of the closet after the lights went out. Every night I fancied the Dracula, Frankenstein, the Wolfman, the Mummy, the Creature, and every other monster running around in my mind would come out and stand next to the bed waiting for me to show some sign of life so they could get me. I always imagined that Dracula was the leader for some reason. I suppose it was because he was so better dressed than the others. Anyway, I watched a lot of TV. Since the horror or suspense series were sort of limited, I watched a lot of comedy shows as well. One of those was Car 54, Where Are You? And I loved it. Car 54 was a show about two patrolmen, Francis Muldoon and Gunther Tootie, who worked out of the 53rd Precinct in New York City. They were two good-hearted men with an almost childlike innocence, which I suppose was one of the reasons it appealed to me as much as it did. And more importantly, it was a funny show. It was created by Nat Hiken, who had previously come up with another classic show, The Phil Silver Show, a.k.a. You'll Never Get Rich, a.k.a. Sergeant Bilko. I used to watch that one, too. I never forgot Car 54 over all the years that passed between it going off the air after only 2 seasons, and my recently procuring a copy of some of the shows. It is just as funny as I remember it being, and I am thrilled to share it with you. As I just mentioned, the show only ran for 2 seasons, but maybe that's a good thing. I have a theory that any sitcom has, at best, 3 good years in it. Exceptional ones make it to 5, and truly excellent ones like The Larry Sanders Show run even longer. I've seen too many shows I adored stay well beyond their welcome. That 70s show was one that, comes to mind immediately. I thought the first season was absolutely classic, especially as I saw so much of my friends and myself on that show, and it was about the decade I came of age in. But midway through the second season, the writers either moved on or just ran out of ideas, and the characters I had come to know and love so well became caricatures of themselves, something that always makes me very sad. Every so often, a really great show will leave the air because the producers would rather go out on a high note than run a well-loved show into the ground for the sake of money. I do miss those shows, but I admire the fact that the people involved had enough integrity to know when to bow out. I myself took a shake at writing a limited run half-hour show based on a place I used to work. It was called The Comedy Hole, and it was based on a basement comedy club where I worked for way too many years. It was a nightmare of a job, but I stayed for two reasons. The people I worked with, whom I loved, and the comedians that appeared at the place. They were put up in what was referred to by the owner as the condo and the rest of us as the crack house. After a while, once I got to know the comedians appearing at the club, it occurred to me that these poor people had nothing to do when they weren't at the club performing. So I would approach them when they arrived and offer to take them around town during the day so they could get out, and we always had a great time. I'd take them to the Art Museum or Coventry or the Crawford Auto Aviation Museum and the Western Reserve Historical Society or the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame when that opened. Then up to Little Italy for lunch, and we always had a riot. Believe me when I say that hanging out with comics is a complete and total blast. I took Brad Garrett to Parmatown one time to do some shopping, and I swear to God, I have never laughed more in the space of one day before or since. Those men and women were terrific people, and I was honored to be friends with them. The Comedy Hole never got past the script for the pilot, but, it was worth a try. Getting back to the subject, let's take a look at the people behind Car 54. Nat Hiken was born on June 23, 1914 in Chicago, Illinois. He inherited his father's sense of humor and was well known as a kibitzer among friends and family. When he was 8, he and his father came up with what they called a party piece, wherein they would do a ventriloquism act with young Nat acting as a dummy. His mother was a humorless woman who was heavily involved in liberal politics, something that would threaten to derail his entertainment career later in life. To start this, let me quote David Everett's excellent bio of Nat Hiken, King of the Half Hour. Nat Hiken's story mirrors a brief, exciting period when inspired producers and writers, based primarily in New York, enjoyed the opportunity of shaping a new medium. He embodied early television's finest qualities, independence and imagination, as well as a demand for the best and appreciation for the melting pot experience. These qualities also made it difficult, if not impossible, for him to adapt when the TV industry began to transform itself in the early 1960s. He remained independent at a time when networks sought control over their producers. He insisted on excellence and comic vision when mediocrity and homogeneous programming became the norm. And he was a compulsive hands-on creator, attentive to his show's every detail at a time of increasing specialization. For all his accomplishments and for all the laughter and good cheer he orchestrated, Nat Hiken deserves to be rediscovered. I could not agree more. As a teenager, Hiken honed his humor, and in college joined the school newspaper, writing a column called The Gripers Club, a parody of advice columns. He usually wrote the questions he answered himself using pseudonyms. After graduating, he came up with the idea of starting a news service concerning local people who had made good in Hollywood, and his cousin Sandy, who worked as a secretary at Republic Pictures, suggested he move out west to pursue the idea. She introduced him to Roland Kibbe, a manager of a local radio station, and announcer Jack Lascouli. He mentioned the Gripers Club to them, and they thought it was a good idea for a radio show which they christened the Grouch Club. I remember listening to that show on the radio when my dad would drive me to school in the morning, and we always shared a good laugh when it was on. While working on that show, Nat discovered a talent for writing sketches, and he was soon hired to write for radio comedian Fred Allen. This required a move back to New York, but Hiken found he didn't miss Hollywood at all. New York was a lot closer lifestyle-wise to his hometown of Milwaukee. He felt he was ready to strike out on his own, however, and soon became producer of the Milton Berle radio show. When Berle left for television, his radio show was canceled, and Hiken was hired as head writer for NBC's 4-Star Review, and later created a sitcom for Martha Raye, which was an immediate hit. After the first season, Hiken was worried the scripts were getting stale, and after meeting boxer Rocky Graziano, put him in the show and tailored the dialogue for Graziano's stiff delivery. Raye and the boxer had a great chemistry, and the show was a hit. In 1950, Hiken was nearly blacklisted when his name appeared in the pamphlet Red Channels, which was a list that compiled suspected communist sympathizers in the entertainment industry. It's hard to conceive today how powerful this pamphlet was at the time. If you were so much as suspected of being a communist, your career was over. Innocent until proven guilty didn't even enter into the argument. Hiken was forced to take out an advertisement denouncing communist beliefs to save his career, and this put a good amount of strain on his relationship with his mother, but it worked. Hiken met Phil Silvers while playing a weekly gym rummy game with a number of other people in showbiz. He was offered a contract with CBS, but they couldn't think of a proper venue to fit the comic into. Since Hiken knew Silvers casually from their gin rummy games, and he had a knack for being able to tailor a script to a personality, he was hired to write, produce, and direct what turned out to be known as You'll Never Get Rich. After shooting a pilot, CBS head William Paley commented, "This is money in the bank. Take it off the rack and go ahead." 39 episodes were ordered up, and word of mouth about the show was so strong that Jack Benny, Milton Berle, and Cary Grant would sit in the audience when the show was filmed. After finding a proper time slot, the show became a huge hit and was renamed The Phil Silvers Show. It was so popular, in fact, that when President Dwight D. Eisenhower, an avid fan, missed an episode, he had his press secretary secure a print for him to screen at the White House the next day. It won 5 Emmy Awards in its first season. After casting about doing various projects, Hiken came up with the idea for Car 54. He'd been kicking around the idea of doing a show featuring 2 cops that had less to do with police work than it did with their various personal concerns. The typical police show at that time was usually a procedural like Dragnet. The policemen in them were always a little robotic and a bit hard-boiled, dedicated to the job and little else. Hiken wanted to concentrate on the human aspects of the men behind the badges. He originally wanted Mickey Shaughnessy and Jack Warden to play the 2 officers, Francis Muldoon and Gunther Tootie, but he couldn't come to an agreement with them on salary, so he hired 2 actors that had appeared on Sergeant Bilko, Fred Gwynne and Joe E. Ross. Fred Gwynne was born Frederick Hubbard Gwynne on July 10, 1926 in New York City. After serving as a radio man in the Navy during World War II, he attended Harvard University and worked on the staff of the Harvard Lampoon. He studied art, music, and theater at Harvard, making his Broadway debut in the play Mrs. McThing with Helen Hayes, Ernest Borgnine, and Professor Irwin Corey. His first movie appearance was as a thug on 1954's On the Waterfront. He appeared on many TV drama shows, including Studio One and the United States Steel Hour. In 1955, he appeared on The Phil Silvers Show, which led to his being cast as Francis Muldoon in Car 54. 2 years after Car 54 was canceled, he was cast as Herman in The Munsters. He did numerous guest appearances as a character, but began to be typecast in the role by television casting people. So he left TV and spent a good number of years appearing in Broadway and off-Broadway stage productions, such as Meredith Wilson's Here's Love and Tennessee Williams' Cat on a Hot Tin Roof as Big Daddy. In 1984, Francis Ford Coppola cast Gwynne as Big Frenchie DeMange in The Cotton Club, which incidentally was a pretty good movie in my opinion. And this led to roles in 1987's Ironweed, 1989's Disorganized Crime, and the same year's Pet Sematary. His last film was 1992's My Cousin Vinny as Judge Chamberlain Haller. In the last years of his life, he lived in a renovated farmhouse in Taneytown, Maryland. He continued singing professionally and wrote and illustrated children's books. Fred Gwynne died from cancer of the pancreas on July 2nd, 1993. Joe E. Ross was born Joseph Rosgowicz on March 15, 1914 in New York City. He began his show business career as a singing waiter, having a lilting tenor, but that ended when his voice cracked. He became a baggy pants comic on the burlesque circuit and can be seen in the film Teaserama with Betty Page and Tempest Storm. He appeared in 1957's Hear Me Good, but that didn't lead to other roles, so he returned to the Borscht Belt doing stand-up comedy. While appearing at the Club Zero in Miami Beach, he was discovered by Nat Hiken and hired to play Mess Sergeant Rupert Ritzik on Sergeant Bilko. After the show was canceled, Hiken brought him back as Officer Gunther Tootie in Car 54. He also appeared with co-star Imogene Coca in a short-lived series in the late 1960s, It's About Time. By all accounts I've seen, Joey Ross was a rough-edged, difficult man to work with, but his talent was unquestionable. I always loved his character of Gunther Tootie, especially his exclamations of, ooh, ooh, whenever he got excited. Joey Ross died of heart failure on August 18, 1982, while performing on stage in Los Angeles, California. One of the things I noticed in revisiting Car 54 is that it was multicultural. It took place in a Jewish-Italian neighborhood, and the precinct was filled with cops of all ethnicities. black, white, Jewish, Italian, Irish, German, and you never saw that on a TV show in the early 60s. Another great thing about it, and something it shares with the Our Gang comedies, is that race was never an issue on the show. It was never mentioned, it was never exploited. Everyone was on the same level and everyone was treated equally. The main characters were, of course, Gunther and Tootie, but the supporting cast, and it was a great one, appeared in just about every episode. Keep an eye open when you watch this show. You'll see dozens of familiar faces, a few of which you'll actually be able to put a name to, like Al Lewis, Charlotte Rae, Nipsey Russell, Ossie Davis, Larry Storch, and Carl Ballantine. The reason for this is that New York City was television central at that time. The networks didn't establish studios in Hollywood until the middle of the decade, and they took over the old motion picture studios that were abandoned when the movie studios moved west. Car 54 was shot at the old Biograph studios, for example, and the Filmways shows, such as The Naked City, were shot in another studio in Harlem. The networks had their pick of the many talented actors and actresses appearing on stage and Broadway and off-Broadway productions. And although at the time television was thought of as a huge step down in prestige, well, you had to pay the rent and put food on the table somehow. As time went on, TV became marginally more respectable, and now you're seeing the culmination of all that talent in history. That's a sobering thought. So right now, sit back, relax, and enjoy Car 54, Where Are You? Right here on Cleveland Classic Cinema.